Craig Wortmann is the founder and CEO of Sales Engine. If you don't know what Sales Engine is, just go online and Google salesengine.com and you'll get a good idea of what it is. He is a professional speaker on subjects of leadership, high performance selling, entrepreneurship, and the power of story. He is the author of a book on leadership called What's Your Story, which is going to be what we're going to be talking about today, and an ebook on influence. He is also a clinical professor of entrepreneurship at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management and the founder of the new Kellogg Sales Institute. He developed the award-winning course called Entrepreneurial Selling, and this was ranked by a magazine as one of the top 10 courses in the country. In addition to the amazing things that Craig does for Kellogg and the other ventures that he's part of, it's going to take me 30 minutes or an hour, which is going to be the entire time we have today to go through all of those accolades. So Craig, thanks for joining us today, and I'll give it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you. And I hear that some of you just came from a session with my friend Karen, Professor O'Connor, who's amazing and a friend of mine at Kellogg. And so I'm glad you got to hear from her. I am super psyched to be with you. As you're saying, it's been a while that we've been working on this to come together. We've got a lot to do, so I'm going to jump in. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. That was super kind. I'm going to share my screen with you folks, and we are going to get going. Before I do that, a couple of ground rules for our chat today, because I know we have to move fast. So the ground rules are two. One is, if you would chat questions to me, that would be great. Or if we want to hear your voices, which I would love to hear your voices from all over the world, please let us know, raise your hand or whatever, and we will find you and unmute you, and you can jump into the conversation. So ground rule number one is, let's make this a conversation if we can. I love this subject. I've written a book about this subject, but I'm still learning about the subject. And so, one thing that is key is this notion of adding stories to our repertoire to be able to tell the right story at the right time for the right reason. That's what we're really about. So that's ground rule number one. Let's have a conversation. I don't want this to be a lecture. I'm not a lecturer. I have more, I have a lot to say, but it really counts what you think, not what I think here. And then the second ground rule is, let's have some fun. This stuff is really fun. This is about you and telling your story. So let's have some fun with this. I'm going to throw a bunch of ideas at you. Again, slow me down, speed me up, whatever you want to do. Jump in with questions. I'm going to start with a quote from Michelle Obama, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. I love this quote. We're actually going to start and finish with Ms. Obama. I love this quote for obvious reasons. This will start us out. This notion of being able to tell the right story at the right time for the right reasons, really, I love her words here. It really allows us to differentiate ourselves and stand out in a crowd. And I think while for some of us that some of you are undoubtedly thinking, well, isn't that fairly straightforward and obvious? It is. The question that we like to ask, and that I ask at Kellogg in my teaching and I ask with my book is, do you have the right story? Is it at the tip of your tongue? Is it at your fingertips such that you can tell it? And oftentimes when we pause on that and think about it, the answer is usually, no, or it's, well, yeah, maybe. And I'll say, okay, then tell me the story. And we sort of stumble through it. And what I want to cause you to think about today is just think about this thing called story as an asset. It's a thing that you carry around with you at all times, and you have these things at the ready. So that's what I'd love to have you think about. Here's how we're going to do this. I call this "What's Your Story?" just because it's the question that I love to ask people. Here's how we're going to do it. This looks like a lot, and it is a lot. We may not make it all the way through. And the reason I have more than we have time for is because I want to make some room for your questions. And so we'll slow down into your questions a little bit. I'm looking at the chat over here to my right on my screen, and I see that you're from literally all over the world. I love that. Welcome to all of you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to wherever you are. But we're going to work through this, and we're going to start with sort of objectives and outcomes really quick. And then we're going to dive into what I call the power of story. Then we're going to switch gears and talk about, okay, if what we've talked about with the power of stories is true, then I really ought to take this seriously. How do I do that? How do I actually use stories such that I can capture them, I can distill them down, make them my own. I can, categorize them in a way that I can really use them. And then we'll close up. Hope that sounds good. So, welcome and outcomes. Here's what we're going to do. This is a little bit of from to. What I would love to have you consider as we get started in our conversation is thinking about where people usually come from when they start talking about storytelling. Is that it is one of these weird things that everybody says, well, of course I'm a storyteller. I'm a human being. I tell stories to my friends all the time. I tell stories at my college, my university. I tell stories on the job, whatever. And that's true. But many times when we actually unpack what's happening when people communicate, is they often are communicating at the level of information or data, which is fine, right? When you hand somebody your resume or your CV, or you tell them about yourself, many times it actually happens in the form of information or data, and that's okay. But what I want to cause you to think is where we're heading to is to appeal to the emotional side of people. We actually know that one of the greatest, if not the greatest lever in persuading people to accept you into a club, persuading people to give you a job, persuading people to go out to a restaurant that you want to go to and not a different one, is actually an appeal to their emotions, because people make decisions in their emotions, and we'll talk more about this. So what I would love to convince you to do is become a collector of your best stories and get them down to the point where you can tell them really well and appeal to the emotional side. So you actually lead with story and it becomes a core part of your conversation. So that's where we're heading. Let's talk about the power of story. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to do just a really quick straw poll. We're going to use the chat mechanism here. What do you bring to an interaction, a meeting, a restaurant, a party? It doesn't have to be a meeting, but what do you bring? And the question I'm asking is, do you bring facts and data, or do you often bring stories? Which one do you actually bring? And I was gonna launch a poll. I'm just gonna do this much more easily in the chat. So Jacob says story. Amira, you say stories. Miranda, stories. This is good. You're on the right track. Taylor, okay, good. Positive vibes. Emmanuel, I love it. Positive vibes, absolutely. The question is, how do those positive vibes take place? Positive energy, you betcha. Comedy, all right. Oh, you guys are great. I'm definitely in the right crowd here. So this is great. And so what I want to encourage you to think about is, then if you're bringing stories to a party, to a meeting, to an interaction of any kind, I love it. Somebody said food. I love that. You're invited to my house if you're bringing stories and food. Is what makes these things so powerful? And this is what I love about teaching you all, is because, I get to explore why things are true and what makes them so powerful. If you think about what happens when you tell a story, some really powerful things happen. And I'm going to give you an example. One of my favorite bodies of research is from Carnegie Mellon. And what's interesting is the very first person in the chat, when you signed in to tell us where you were, I'm searching through the chat, was, I believe it was Pittsburgh. Yes, it was. Sarah is from Pittsburgh. I love that. So my Pittsburgh colleague, this was research done at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And just check this out. In 1992, 3 researchers went into the Carnegie Mellon Student Center at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And they said to the students, we are doing some research on how you young people use technology. These are all college-age students. And they said, we're going to take you to a different building down campus, and we're going to give you a survey on how you use technology. And we're doing some research on how young people use technology, and we're just curious how you use it. It's no big deal. It'll take 6 or 8 minutes of your time. And for your trouble, we're going to give you $5. So folks, these students seeing, $5 in their immediate future for doing 6 minutes worth of work on a survey, they all rush down to this other building. They take the survey, and 2 friends, Craig and Emmanuel, or maybe I'll say Emmanuel and Sarah, these 2 students at Carnegie Mellon, I'm making this up, guys, but I'm not making up the research. Emmanuel and Sarah walk out of their Pittsburgh Carnegie Mellon building, and each of them is holding an envelope with their $5. They're holding an envelope, and they walk out, and Sarah says to Emmanuel, she says, Emmanuel, did you give any money to Rokia? and save the children. And Emmanuel looks at Sarah a little bit confused, and he says, I gave some money to save the children, but Rokia, what are you talking about, Sarah? And she says, well, you know, Emmanuel, in my envelope with my $5, there was a pledge form from Save the Children. And it told a story of a little girl, 9 years old, called Rokia, who's dying of a waterborne illness that's entirely treatable, et cetera, save the children. And it was wrapped around my $5. And so I gave some money. Did you? She says to her friend Emmanuel. And Emmanuel says, you know, that's weird, Sarah, because in my envelope with my $5, there was also a pledge form from Save the Children. And it said in Malawi, Africa, on an annual basis, there are 9 million cases of waterborne illness, 11 million cases of malaria. They're all entirely treatable, et cetera, save the children. And so Emmanuel says to Sarah, so I gave some money too, because that was also wrapped around my $5. But folks, you see where this is going, right? This was not research on technology at all. That was a ruse, that was a trick. The researchers were actually researching, that's right, Almera, the power of story versus facts. Because most people, when they go into a meeting or they walk into a room or they're in an interview for a job, they talk about the facts of themselves. I'm 22 years old. I had this job when I was in high school. I did this. I'm from Lagos, or I'm from Chicago, or I'm from wherever. And they give the data. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But how might they be more persuasive, more convincing, more powerful in that moment? And what the Carnegie Mellon research discovered, of course, is that the stories are much more powerful. So now I want you to go back to chat and I want you to guess the answer. Sarah, and I'm picking on Emmanuel. Emmanuel only got the facts. 9 million cases of malaria, 11 million cases of waterborne illness, whatever, blah, 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 save the children. And he gave some money. And Sarah got the story of Rokia. How much money did she give? And remember, you're playing with $5 here. So first, how much money did Emmanuel give? The fact-based pledge. How much did it yield, do you think? Let me see what you got in chat. I'm going to sip of coffee. Sabrina, $1 or $2, a couple bucks. It looks like it's trending to 0. Somebody said 5. Okay, good. So it's roughly $2. Guys, good guess. Good guess. Okay, I'll tell you what it is in a second. Any other guesses? Versus, somebody said, Nutella said versus $5 for the girl. We're coming to that. So facts 20%, story 80%. You folks are good guessers. The actual dollar amount was $1.38. So Emmanuel, again, I'm making that up, but the fact-based cohort gave $1.38. How much did the story yield? Already some of you say 5. How much did Sarah give? All of it? 5? See, this is what I love about you all. Mahir says 450. I think it was, Aparit said 4. Good for you. You're going the right way. The answer is $2.38. $2.38. So think about this, guys. This is double what the fact-based pledge yields, okay? Now, why is that? Why does that happen? This is the operative question for our discussion. The reason it happens is because stories do 2 things that other forms of information don't do. They provide context to make a decision, and they connect to emotion. So just stop and think about that for a second. This is absolutely critical. Context and emotion. There's about 5 decades of research done by all kinds of people that I will not name here, but if you're interested, some of the links are in the deck that I sent you. There's about 5 decades of research showing us that to be more persuasive, you have to make an emotional appeal. And the reason Rokia, one little girl, is more powerful than 20 million people is because you can connect to her. Every single person on planet Earth, without exception, can picture a 9-year-old girl. And when that girl is put in peril, that's an emotional reaction. 20 million is an intellectual reaction. And Vineeth, yes, so it's pathos over logos. That's exactly right. This is what Aristotle said 2,000 years ago when he talked about storytelling. We need to appeal to people's pathos, not just their logos. And there's nothing wrong with logic, you guys. There's nothing, I'm not saying facts aren't important. But what I am saying is people like us, you and me, we wear facts all over us. And to be more effective in any room, we should be telling stories. So I told you the Save the Children story. This is my little my little image of the Save the Children story. I told you the Save the Children story to motivate you to take stories more seriously, rather than just showing you the facts of the Carnegie Mellon research. I did that by design because I'm trying to influence you right now to take stories more seriously. Not that I don't want you to deal with facts, not at all. I want you to learn a lot of facts. You learn facts every day. But in order to be the most persuasive person in any room, at any party, in any interview, you've got to be taking stories seriously. Okay, we have a question in chat, and I'm going to let you read this slide. Just read through this really quick. I'm interested to hear what you think of Annette Simmons, her quote here. It's pretty provocative. Jacob says, there are so many stories to tell and listen to. How do we do that? Jacob, it's a great question. There are a lot. What the problem, Jacob, I think, and you may disagree with me here, and that's totally fine, but you may disagree. The problem that we're solving is actually the opposite. Left to our own devices, what a psychologist calls a default behavior, our default behaviors is usually to walk away from story, is not to tell stories. Now, I realize, Jacob, and all of you, that if you're at a restaurant with your friends or you're at a coffee shop with your friends, that's a different situation. It's a different context where many of you will tell stories back and forth, and that's wonderful. What I am suggesting, though, is in most business functions or getting into university or getting accepted, you often default to facts, and that's actually the problem we're solving. So if you're telling too many stories, Jacob, I would say you're on the right track because you are actually being more persuasive. Why? Because you're creating context for people and you're connecting to emotion. AJ, it does also matter how we tell stories. Hold that thought, AJ. We're going to get to that really quickly at the end. And then Zara, can you become a storyteller but still remain authentic and genuine? I would actually argue, Zara, that you are authentic and genuine when you're telling your most authentic stories. So again, this workshop is designed to answer that question. Keep me honest on that. Tara, how do you know when to use certain stories? Again, I'm pushing you down the road a little bit, guys. We're going to answer these questions. These are fantastic. Keep them coming. Let me push a little bit farther, and then I'm going to come back to the chat. What Annette Simmons here is saying is, look at this last line. This is pretty provocative. This is why facts are not terribly useful in influencing others. Folks, we know this. We know this from the argument that the world is having around climate change. Is it happening? Is it not happening? For some of you, that's entirely obvious, but you do realize there's a whole set of facts on both sides. And what both sides need to do is be better storytellers. And so this begins to answer some of your questions. Dhruvan, there are so many fake stories out there. How do we filter them? You know what? You begin by telling your own authentic stories because your stories are key. Now, Dhruvan, this is an interesting question. There are a lot of fake stories around there. So when I learned the Carnegie Mellon research, I actually had to go out and verify that that Carnegie Mellon story that I just told you is actually true. Because otherwise I could just be repeating a fake story. So, and again, that's a little bit out of the scope of this particular session, is verifying the knowledge that you're getting. What are the facts? What are the stories? Are these stories actually true? I would suggest be very suspicious of fake news and make sure that the stories that you're bringing into your orbit are actually true, and you just have to do some homework on that. Okay, let me keep going, and then I'm going to come back to some more questions. And some of these questions are about storytelling. How do can you become a good storyteller? What's the length of a story? We're going to answer in a little bit. Okay, this is a jar of mayonnaise. This was a really clever experiment that pointed to how powerful stories can be. This was done by a guy named Rob Walker. And again, the links to this, and Emmanuel and Amir will keep me honest on this. I'll make sure you get the links to these articles if you're interested in looking up the facts behind the stories. A guy named Rob Walker got very interested in why stories are so powerful and why this Carnegie Mellon research happens. He read the Carnegie Mellon research, and he did a very clever and funny experiment. This was in the United States. He went out to garage sales and yard sales, and he bought 300 items between $1 and $2 in value. He bought a jar of mayonnaise that was 3 ounces, little tiny jar of mayonnaise like this one. He bought a broken toy. He bought a cigarette lighter. and he put them next to a fact-based bullet-pointed list of features. So if I put one next to this jar of mayonnaise, it would say 3 ounces, unopened, made by Kraft Foods or whatever, and he put it on eBay and sold it. Then he took the exact same item, he had a story written about each item, put it on eBay and sold it. Now what do you think the difference in price is? And it's not 2 times. It's not Rokia all over again. This was actually 2,700%. The jar of mayonnaise sold for $51. Little 3-ounce jar of mayonnaise sold for $51 on eBay. How does that possibly happen? What we now know to be true, folks, is stories are anywhere from 2 to 50 times more powerful than facts. So we are much more powerful and persuasive when we use stories because they connect to emotion. So yeah, Brian, you're right. That was a good story. And I can't tell you the story. We don't have time. But the problem with that story is, and this goes back to Dhruvan, I think, Dhruvan's comment, is that story was fictional. He just made up a story about a 3-ounce jar of mayonnaise. And that's why it got the impact. Folks, our stories have to be true. The stories that I tell you have to be true, or now I'm in the territory of just fake stories, which is fun for ghost stories. If I made up a ghost story right now and told it, we'd have some fun. But when we're selling ourselves, when we're selling our ideas, when we're persuading others to get on board with our ideas, our stories have to be true. But stories are 2 to 50 times more powerful than facts because of context and emotion. My friend Linda Hill, I'm privileged to know Linda. She is a professor at Harvard Business School, amazing woman. She wrote the book, Becoming a Manager and Becoming a Leader. And I just love this quote. Our impact has to be high. It doesn't mean it's great if we're well-intended, but good intentions have to come with impact, guys. We have to walk into every room and own every room that we're in. And the number one tool of influence is the ability to tell the right story at the right time for the right reasons. Okay, we got a bunch of great questions in here. I'm going to keep going because some of the answers to your questions are embedded in the next 2 sections. So do I have a thumbs up to keep going? Cool, thumbs up. Okay, here we go. So capturing, where do you actually need stories? And here, the operating metaphor, you all, is we all as human beings walk around with a quiver of arrows on our backs at all times. And I can metaphorically reach back and grab that arrow that I need because I'm going into an interview or I'm walking into a classroom. I'm doing a session on storytelling and I want to talk about how stories are powerful. So I reach back and I grab the Carnegie Mellon story, the Rokia story, or I reach back and I grab the mayonnaise story and I can pull that out of my quiver at a moment's notice. So now what I want you to do, and we're not going to do this in real time, what I want you to just think about is I want you to think about just for a second with just with yourself, think about where you need to be telling stories and tell me this in chat because I made a decision. We're not going to have time to do a breakout room. Tell me in chat, where do you actually need to be telling true stories such that you are more persuasive? In other words, where are you persuading and convincing people? Lauren, exactly. So job interview, wow, a lot of you are saying job interviews in the classroom, applying to college, Zara, absolutely. College essays, oh my gosh, this is great. Getting investors, pitching a product, social media, sure. College fairs, coffee chat. I mean, look how, friends, mentoring, look how many situations you're in where you need to be getting a loan. So how do you come up with these stories? And just pause there for a second, you all. And by the way, this is hard work I'm asking you to do. And so I love that you're blowing up the chat. I love that you're in this with me. Thank you. This is hard work that you guys are doing. I'm asking you for hard stuff. Like, you need to know, in order for me to grab the right arrow, what I call the right story at the right time for the right reasons, you know what also has to be true. I have to know where my target is. And if my target is my Rishi, my grad thesis projects, or AJ, John asking for a reference, or, Zawad, every time you're talking to someone, getting a loan, Vineeth, that's your target. So if Vineeth needs to get a loan, his target is the loan officer of that bank or investor of some sort. He needs to pull the right arrow out. How do you do this? This is hard work. And if I can convince you of one thing today, it is to become a collector of stories. That does not mean every story needs to be collected. Only the ones that work for you, and especially the ones that are about you. Because if I'm the bank loan officer and Vineeth is sitting in front of me trying to ask for a loan, I need to know about Vineeth and all of his facts, but I need to know how he's motivated, how he's designed, how he's built. So he or she, whoever's sitting in front of me in that loan office, can resonate with me and persuade me that they are trustworthy and that they'll pay back that loan. One of the ways we do that is something called story mapping. And this is my friend Diane Castile, who is a multiple winner of the Moth Story Competition. What she teaches is a way to map our stories. And so I'm showing you this. And again, you've got this deck, so you can come back to the deck and just understand how you do this. This is what's called a story map. Notice in the middle, I drew a circle around Kellogg. I teach at Kellogg, but I also went to Kellogg as a student, 150 years ago. I went to Kellogg. And so when I draw Kellogg in a bubble, then I can start drawing different circles. Well, I went down to the lower left. I was in the entrepreneurship program. In the upper left, I had a lot of homework. So I say, ugh, homework. And that led me to a team meeting. And that led me to learn how to read, really read. And then entrepreneurship, I took a class with a crazy guy named Professor Merkin, and he told a hilarious story. And so now what's happening, you all, through this mapping exercise is I'm learning where I actually have my stories. So again, let me just stop here. If Vineeth is getting a loan, or Tara is making a friend, or Haley is marketing her business, or JT's going to a career fair, what JT would probably want to think about, or Haley would want to think about in marketing her business, is she would want to draw a circle around her business in the middle here, and then just talk about all the things. How did she found the business? And that would be a circle in the upper left. Who did she talk to about the business when she was first getting started? What was the first thing she designed as the first version of the product? And so this map starts to fill out, and Haley suddenly realizes, oh my God, I have all these great stories to tell about my business. And so now if I'm going to market it, I can tell those stories. So story mapping is a really simple and powerful way to start generating what stories we need to be telling. So that's the capture. So let me pause here for some more questions, and we're going to keep moving and answer some more of your questions. AJ, I couldn't agree more. Stories can be both entertaining and very important. They can be both. And you're right, you're pointing out, look at the books you read, the movies you go to. Your most memorable moments with your friends, your family are often centered around stories. Okay, so now one of the ways we talked about one of the ways to really own your stories and capture them. Now we have to talk about distilling them down. And I'm going to spend a little but of time on this slide because this goes way back earlier in the chat to a bunch of your really good questions. And I'm going back really quick to, let's see, AJ's question about story being the right length. So Tara, this will partly answer your question. And Jacob, a little bit of your question. Here's what you're looking at, you all. This is a tool that I came up with two colleagues, Carter Cast and David Schoenthal at the Kellogg School. And what you're seeing here is that a story has, the most simplest version of a story, of course, you've all heard is every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. And that's true. If you break it down just a little bit more subtly, a story starts with context. It starts to climb to conflict. It goes to climax, and then it goes to closure. So we call it the 4 C's of storytelling. And what I would suggest that you start to do in capturing your stories and then distilling them down is to just think very simply about the 4 C's. So if Vineeth is going in to get a loan, he might lay out the story. If Haley is marketing her business, she might say, what's a great story I could tell about the founding of my company, called an origin story? And I'll tell you an origin story in a second that you'll see the context, conflict, climax, and closure in the story. But yeah, Brian, sounds like a Marvel movie. I'm not sure it's quite a Marvel movie. You can do this with any story. And here's the thing, Brian, it doesn't have to be a Marvel movie. It doesn't have to be this blockbuster. It just has to be a story. But the story will automatically tell me more about Emmanuel or Erica or Haley or Brian. It will tell me about who you are as a person, and it will appeal to my emotions. So this is a worksheet, and it has 2 sides. So I'm going to show you this one, and then I flip it over, And again, I put this in the deck for you to read later. We're not going to do this now. But what I'm doing here with the second cut, and I'm going to jump back for a second. The first cut of the story is just getting down some blocking and tackling. Here's the context. So Haley's saying to herself, I'm marketing my business. What do I need to tell people to bring them into the story? What's the context? And then what do I want them to feel as conflict builds? And by the way, guys, conflict doesn't have to be bad. Conflict can be good. What happens at the aha moment where Haley says, and then Emmanuel, I started this business, and it's like, boom, aha moment is the climax. And then what does she want from Emmanuel as she closes the story? Okay. Then the second piece is just meant for you to do a second cut in prose. You write it out, and then a third cut, you write it out again, and you're distilling it down. And you know, distilling means make it smaller, make it shorter. What David and Carter and I did on this document is give you a sense of how we did this for Sarah Blakely, who some of you undoubtedly have heard of. She's the woman who started Spanx and became an unbelievably successful entrepreneur starting from zero. And she has quite a story about how she started that business. AJ, great question. Do all conflicts need to be solved? No, they do not. And again, let me tell you all a story that I like very much. And Dhruvan says, can you have more than one climax? You can, but you want to be careful. Oftentimes, you want to leave one climax in your story so the use case, meaning the reason, the moral to the story, the reason I tell you the story is absolutely clear. Ah, Brooks, good for you. Brooks recommends Sarah Blakely. Sarah Blakely is a phenomenon, okay? So Tara, it's funny because now that I'm thinking about my best stories, they fall into this form. Yes, they do. It's almost impossible not to tell a story without these things. So now I'm going to leave this slide up and I'm going to tell you one of my favorite current stories, my current favorites. I have hundreds of stories that I've collected because I'm a nerd about storytelling, and I have to model this behavior. I can't say to all of you, you got to tell your stories without having my own. So this guy, one of the guys that helped me to invent this slide that you're looking at, Carter Cast, he's an amazing man. He was the founder of a little company that you've heard of called Walmart.com. He's an amazing guy. He and I both serve at a venture capital company in Chicago. And one day he was asked to evaluate a business that is selling cat litter. Yes, cat litter. And because he's an e-commerce expert, and this cat litter business was selling cat litter online. And we were asked to look at it, he and I, to evaluate whether this was a company that we wanted to invest in as a venture capital company. And so we got to the call, and unfortunately for the entrepreneur, the call was scheduled at night. My friend Carter was driving through the rain, and I was at home after a long day of work. This is not an ideal situation for a call, the first call with two venture capital people. And so this young man, 27 years old, his name is Daniel. He's got this cat litter business. He comes to the call, and now stop here. What do you think would happen if you were this cat litter business and you get on the phone for the first time? You're going to get one shot to talk to two venture capital people about investing in your business. And if you're successful, you might get a $3 to $5 million check. And if you're unsuccessful, you get zero. And it'll be the last call you ever do with that firm. What would you think? What would you do in that moment? And I'll wait for a second and see what you got. What would you do? Cry? Tara, you wouldn't cry. You're braver than that. Start with a cat meow. I love it. Provocative. I love it. Tell your story, Mahir. Yeah. Tell a joke. Tell a story. You're darn right, you guys. You know where I'm going on this. So I serve in this venture capital firm. Let me tell you what happens. Not 9 times out of 10, but 99 times out of 100. Here's what happens. It's exactly the opposite of what AJ just said in the chat. People don't appeal to our emotions. Here's exactly what they do. I do this every week, guys. Young entrepreneur comes, says, Craig, Carter, delighted. Thank you for taking the time. Let me tell you about my business. And they proceed to show the charts and the data about how fast their company's going to grow, their pro forma financial statements, how much money this thing's going to make in 5 years, what the business model is, what the pricing is, the features and benefits of the product. I could go on and on and on. And folks, once again, there's nothing wrong with that. Those are the facts. But I can tell you, it is exactly the opposite of what you're saying in chat. It doesn't appeal to my emotions. It is an intellectual sale that relies on me to get to know you and your business through a very unemotional appeal. This is the default behavior for almost every entrepreneur I've ever seen. Paris is right. Facts tell, stories sell. Precisely. Let me demonstrate that. We get on the phone with this young man, Daniel, and I can tell you this is exactly what happened. We do a little bit of small talk. Carter was driving the call from our side. I was more just listening in and participating. And Carter said, you know, Daniel, meet Craig. I'm Carter. You know, blah, blah, small talk, small talk. I apologize for driving in the rain. Craig's at home because this had to get scheduled at night. We're so sorry, but we're excited to hear about your business. Tell us about your business. And here's exactly what this young man did. There was a long pause, and he said, 3 years ago, my cat died, and I was devastated. Like any pet owner would be, I loved this thing, and he just dropped dead. And for 2 weeks, I wandered around in a fog. And I got really, really angry because I wanted to know why this happened. And I wanted to make sure it wouldn't happen to other people. And so in my anger, I went and visited a bunch of veterinarians to figure out why this could have happened to a 3-year-old, otherwise perfectly healthy cat. And you know what, you two? I learned something about cats. Cats are stoic animals. They wear their emotions on the inside. They're not like dogs. If you're a dog owner, when you get home from work or you get home from school, you know exactly what you're getting. The dogs wear their emotions on the outside, but not cats. And guys, what this means is a cat can have a terribly debilitating disease and you'll never know it. You'll never know it unless you go to the quarterly recommended veterinarian visit, quarterly checkup that costs about $280 on average. I didn't do that, and I regret it. So I resolved to fix this problem, and I invented a new cat litter. And it's based on a white silica that is mined in only 4 places in China, and I own the exclusive rights to one of those mines. The reason that's important is white silica is 4 times lighter than clay. And clay is how every other cat litter in the world is made. This means it's heavy. My cat litter is not heavy, which means I can disrupt this industry by changing the business model. Why? Because I can ship it now. Furthermore, I treated that white silica with an enzyme such that if your cat has any of 7 disease states, when it pees on the cat litter turns red. So now you know. What questions do you have about this? That was his story. That was exactly how he started this call. And I see wow in the chat. That's exactly what my friend Carter and I said. And we're, you know, I'm obviously an older man. Carter's a few years older than me. We've seen 5,000 pitches in our lives. And we were like, and Carter later told me, it was very funny. He later told me that he had pulled off the highway and he was just gripping his steering wheel as hard as he could, staring at the dashboard because he was so focused on this young man's story. Guys, that's storytelling. That's an example of when a story is 2,700% more powerful than any facts you could tell me. And by the way, notice something about that story. What was in that story? A bunch of facts. A quarterly vet visit is $280. Nobody ever does it. Cat litter is made out of clay. It's very heavy. So you have to drive to the store and get it. You can't create a shipping, you can't do a subscription business out of that business model. It doesn't work. The economics don't work. So he actually made an economic argument inside of a compelling story. That was 100% true. We went on to help this young man and his business because of that 5-minute story that he told us at the beginning. Now, one of the questions in chat, exactly, Dhruvan, it was facts woven within a story. So what I'm not saying to you is leave the facts behind. What I am saying to you is lead with story. It will do you so much good in your life. You will be 2 to 50 times more persuasive in any room you're in if you lead with story. And I don't mean start every conversation with a story. That's not what I mean. But I do mean be ready. And what readiness means is you've got a quiver of arrows hanging on your back at all times. You've put them through the ringer of this slide, and you've figured out the second and third cut of the story such that you can tell the story. So let's go to the last one, and I want to show you this, and then I want to open this up for some questions. We're doing great, and your questions are amazing. So the question that was asked early on in the chat is, how do you tell a good story? And I promised you I would get there. Now let's just skinny this thing down. Here's how I would love to have you think about your own capability as storytellers, because guess what? Each and every one of you is a storyteller. If I followed you around for a week, you would tell dozens of stories. I would catch you doing it. But now, when you think about the craft, the art of telling stories, and Daniel did an amazing job, is the story has two arcs. One is west to east, or left to right. One is north to south, or up and down. I'll show you the left to right first, or west to east. This is the business arc of it, what we call the business arc of a story. The story has to go somewhere. If I just told you a story about my weekend right now, that, you know, it might be a fun story, but you would be like, why is he telling us about his weekend? This has nothing to do with this talk, right? And so it would be completely off vector. There's no business getting done. You've heard the phrase job to be done. The job to be done of a story is the business arc. I told you the Daniel Pretty Litter, it's called Pretty Litter, by the way, that's his business, called Pretty Litter. That's pretty clever, right? Because it's white and then turns red. So it's Pretty Litter. And I told you that story because the business of that story is he's actually educating two venture capital people about his business as he's telling the story. So the moral to that story is incredibly powerful. I face this problem myself as the entrepreneur. I am solving a problem I face myself. I was devastated by it, and I'm rewiring an entire industry's business model. He's doing all that with one story. And that's what's going on here. So if you look at the click downs, the drop downs here, this is what context is doing for you. Help me understand why I care. Why did Carter and I care about his story? Because of the first sentence. 3 years ago, my cat died. How can I not care? Unless I'm just inhuman, how can I not care about that? Like, wow, I'm sorry, right? That would be your natural reaction. Everybody on this call would say, oh my God, I'm sorry. Then conflict. Again, conflict doesn't have to be bad. If Haley's marketing her business, conflict could be funny. It could be a funny stumble that she made when she first brought out our product and it just didn't work. I have stories like that for my own 3 businesses, right? Where I just screwed things up. It could be funny. Climax. What do you want me to take away? What's the aha moment? The aha moment of Daniel's story is it tells you if your cat has 7 disease states by turning red. You go, wow, like that. And then his closure was, what questions can I answer for you? Which was a beautiful way to close that story. Like the guy's back all the business. I'm all business here, fellas. Let's do this thing. So that's the business arc of the story. Then this is the north-south. And the reason I say north-south is what I want you to do is I want you to stretch your stories. Daniel stretched his story way down emotionally by saying 3 years ago, my cat died and I was devastated. That's an emotional down. That's a downstroke. Emotional can be upstroke. The best movies you go to, the best books you read are the ones that are like this. They go up and down because we as human beings, we love that emotional roller coaster. Your stories do that too. The stories you tell do that. So the question here is, what is the emotional arc of a good story? What do I want people to actually feel while I'm telling them that story? And if you unpack Daniel's story, if you unpack the Carnegie Mellon story, what you can see is that I changed the emotions on you a couple of times throughout that story. I did that by design. I smiled when I was being Daniel, and I smiled when I said, if you're a dog owner, you know exactly what you're getting when a dog, because dogs wear their emotions on the outside. And he did it just like that. He was joyful in that moment, even though it was within a very serious story about his cat dying and him being angry. That was another emotion. Okay. So what we can do is we can design our stories to have the impact. And every single one of those arrows back here in the quiver has that ability to be designed for impact. One more time for the record, what I'm not saying to all of you is every story has to go, woo, like this, because you would exhaust people. It would be like going to 9 movies in a row, 9 Marvel movies in a row. You'd be exhausted and wrung out. And you know that already. But what you don't want to do is leave everything at the level of facts, because if you leave everything at the level of facts, you actually dampen your impact and you're less than 2 times as powerful. Okay, so the last question here to be asking is, when you're telling a story, and this is a not a worksheet, but this is a little slide for you to use to keep yourself honest as you're designing your stories. The best way to do this is for, you know, Dhruvan to work with Almira or Emmanuel or Haley and say, hey, I'm going to tell you a story. Were you engaged? Did it do the job? Here's the job to be done of this story. I wanted to convince you to give me a loan, or I wanted to convince you to invest in my business or market my business, whatever. Give me a job at this interview. And were the 4 C's apparent? And then what did you feel? How did you feel while I told you the story? If you can get solid answers and feedback from these things, you can really fine tune your stories. Okay, so let me stop there before we head to closing. We've got about 9 minutes left. And Emmanuel and team, I am delighted. I probably undoubtedly skipped some of your questions, and I'm looking. I won't answer the detailed questions about cat litter because I really know nothing about it. I'm much better to answer your questions on storytelling. But folks, what have you got for me? What other questions do you have as we start to wrap this up? And I can share a few more thoughts with you. This was super fun. Man, did that go fast. Zara, how and when did you become a storyteller? Thank you for asking that question. That's a fun question for me to answer. I helped start a company back in the year 2000 in software. And what we were doing was creating a software package called Scenarios. And what Scenarios did was they tried to tackle very complex challenges within companies, like how to teach people how to negotiate, how to teach people how to be better leaders, how to teach people to deal with ethical dilemmas. And the way we did that, Zara and everybody, was we set them in stories, and then we deployed these stories over software out to these global enterprises. And that's when I fell in love with stories, because I saw the impact they were having on people. And then I started to ask the key question, why? Why are these things called stories so powerful? And that's when I sat down and started to interview people and do research and write my book. So that's really how I got started. Great question. And I see one that popped up in the Q&A too, from Sydney. What advice would you give to young adults who want to become successful entrepreneurs? Oh my gosh, big, huge question. I'll take a bite at that question, Sydney. My best advice for young people, if you can, is to join, even as an intern, if you know, and I realize everybody's circumstances are different, but if you can join as an unpaid intern, a paid intern, get a job, get up close to entrepreneurial enterprises, and you can do all this study. And studying is good. Look, I'm a teacher. I assign studying all the time, and that's good. You can read books about entrepreneurship. The best way to do it, though, is to get up close with a business. And then, Sydney, ask questions. Ask as many questions as you can. Why is this true? Why does that work? Why did that guy Daniel tell the story instead of just, how does that business model work? Keep asking those questions. The word for that is curiosity. The best entrepreneurs are the ones that are most curious. And Sydney, just a one extra, one of my venture investors used to say a lucky strike extra. Here's a lucky strike extra for your question, is always be asking the entrepreneurs what questions they can't answer, because that often reveals, when we ask an entrepreneur like Daniel, when we say, what questions can't you answer? And he's ready for that question, we know he's authentic. And we know he's even more authentic when he says, and fellas, here's what I can't answer yet that really scares me about this business. When he proactively tells us that, we fall in love even more, because that's a person who's incredibly self-aware. It's a great question. Let me try to tackle a few more in rapid fire.
There's one question I wanted to push
please.
away. I think it's important. This is from Zara. I noticed that when you speak to us, you address us by our names. Is that a deliberate technique to make the conversation seem more personal?
Yes. Short answer is yes. Longer answer is there's research. We love our names. Our parents gave us our names. We love our names. We love hearing our names. Do you know that this is literally true? If your name is Dennis, you are more likely to become a dentist. You filled in that blank. It's called autofill. You filled that in. If your name is Lawrence, you're more likely to become a lawyer. You know that. There's research. So I use your names deliberately. Now, I also usually, and I failed to do this at the beginning, apologize in advance if I screw up your names, because names are important. And so yes, Zara, great question. Okay, so a couple others here. Jacob, yes, I have heard of Haroon and the Sea of Stories. It has been a long time since I looked at that, so I forget what it's about. Dhruvan, can you share a story of one of your failed startups? You bet I can, because I can reach right back into that quiver and grab that story. I have actually many stories like that. Biggest mistake I made in my first business, Dhruvan and you all, was I thought I was smarter than the market. And what that means is I had this idea that I thought was world changing. And to this very day, this is 20 years ago, to this very day, I still believe that. But there's a difference between what's in my head and what people will actually buy. And so what I did, big mistake, $3.5 million mistake. I raised $3.5 million of other people's money, what we call OPM, other people's money. And I proceeded to spend it to build software that I was convinced that the world needed. And I made one key mistake, and it wasn't spending the money to build the software. It was making sure that I was curious and talking to people every day that I was building that software to say, hey, Emmanuel, here's what I'm building. What do you think? Hey, Erica, the next day, here's what I'm building. It's a day further. Here's what I'm building. What do you think? What I did was stupid. I stayed with it thinking my own brain could guide me. And we came up with something I thought was beautiful. And I took it to market and they went, like that. Big collective shrug. That was a very, very expensive mistake that I never made again. So there's your story, Dhruvan. We've got time for one more and then we have to wrap up. Tiffany, if you notice your story isn't reaching your audience midway when you're telling it, how would you go about maintaining the motivation or boost people's attention to tell the story to the end? This is a really good question. I have two thoughts for you, Tiffany. If you're truly in the middle of a story, and look, I've been there. You can tell I'm a storyteller, so I love telling stories. I've been there where I'm sort of midway through a story and it's not landing. I might just stop and say, you know what? Let me bring this to a conclusion and tell the last line of the story and just save you the trouble of listening all the way through. That's one. My better answer, Tiffany, is what happens before you tell the story. That worksheet I showed you that I shared with Emmanuel to share with all of you, the What's Your Story canvas. The reason we designed that is to answer your question, which means make the story really short before you start telling it, and then save yourself of the trouble of ever having that happen. Your story should be short. Daniel, there are exceptions to this. My pretty little story is like, depending on how I tell it, because there's actually another version of that story that it's much longer that I tell, it can be about 3 to 5 minutes. That's about the outside limit of storytelling. Unless you're sitting down at the holidays or at a restaurant with your friends, that's fine because you have more license. The context gives you more license to tell longer stories. But Tiffany, it's a great question. I would suggest you get really disciplined at that middle part that we talked about today, which is distilling your stories down. Okay, folks, I'm looking at my clock. We got a minute and a half. We got the failed startup. Vineeth here, I saw yours. I did an interview a while back that asked a lot of questions regarding my experiences. I talked a lot about a certain story I had, but I have a feeling that I was very repetitive, and that was probably the reason why I didn't get the job. How can I avoid this? Well, thank you for sharing that. First of all, Vineeth, I've been there right there with you, where I've been repetitive with my stories and have failed more times than I've succeeded. So I'm right there with you, and good for you. How can you avoid this? You make sure that you've got multiple stories. Build that quiver of arrows. I cannot say to you all enough. I mean, I've been on this mission I will be on this mission for the rest of my life. It is to help you capture, distill, and tell your best stories. And so Vineeth, what that looks like in your interview is when the interviewer pivots and asks you something different, you say, well, I shared the story of spending a lot of money on my first product. Let me tell you a different story about something that addresses that. And then you just reach back and you grab that arrow. I want to finish by acknowledging something that I acknowledged halfway through. This is a lot of work, you guys. It's a lot of work. And I admit that. It's also the most important work that you will do. You can own any room that you're in. You can do what we call at Kellogg, showing up, but not only just show up, you can stand out and break through in any room you're in if you're telling the right story at the right time for the right reasons. But what that dictates is you got to have them. So I hope you all found this valuable. I hope you all go forth from here and collect your stories and then begin practicing. Practice in front of the mirror, practice on each other. Emmanuel, back to you, my friend.
Oh, awesome. What a way to close. This has been super interesting. I actually just put up a post on LinkedIn about one of your cool tips. So if you see a tag from Emmanuel, hence that's from this session. So thank you for that. And I hope that everyone, it's absolutely, it's a non-starter because there has been so much to take away from this session. It's been extremely valuable. I love storytelling, and there is so much that I think I can use from this session to go distill my own story so that I can be a little bit more effective as an entrepreneur. So thank you so much, Craig. Thanks, Erica, for joining us today. And for the students that want to connect with Craig, you can just connect with him on LinkedIn, follow him, follow his work, and everything else. Oh, we have it here. So you have this deck. Please make sure you go read his work. And if you have any more questions, just connect with him on LinkedIn. Craig, is that fair to say?
You got it. These are our main social channels. Please connect with us on LinkedIn and we will respond. We're on Instagram quite frequently. So please look for us, give us feedback, direct message us, and we'll get back to you. My best to you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, and hopefully I would have you in the next version of the VIP program in the fall. Just sending that invitation your way already.
Awesome. Thanks you all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.